This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell. The reaction has been swift and harsh to the vote for independence on Iraqi Kurdistan. Iraq's central government shut down international flights. Turkey threatened an economic blockade. Iran sent tanks to the border with Kurdistan. And the U.S. said the vote was not legitimate. We're going to talk about what is next with Kurdistan with Goran Zaneti. He's a Kurdish American and independent journalist. He's produced a documentary on Kurdish refugees stuck on the Turkish-Syrian border called Resistance is Life. Thanks for joining us, Goran.
Thank you for having me.
Well, everybody made their statement to Kurdistan and said, look, this is not going to fly. So what's next?
Well, I think the Kurdish political leadership is in a bit of a bind. They carried out the referendum, and there's an expectation on the part of the Kurdish voters that they do execute on the results of the referendum. So the Kurdish leadership has, specifically the Kurdish president, Masoud Barzani, has stated that independence will happen, whether it's within the next couple months or the next couple of years. And he's sort of demanding negotiations with Baghdad based on this issue. The government in Baghdad, specifically Prime Minister Abadi, has rejected any negotiations that would take place with the results of the referendum in mind. So he's stated that he will not negotiate if the Kurdish leadership doesn't scrap the results and do away with it.
So that really puts the Kurdish leadership between a rock and a hard place. I mean, the whole region is against them, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. The reaction from the neighboring states, particularly Turkey and Iran, has been very negative. Iran has allegedly closed all the border gates with the Kurdistan region, where this is a big deal, considering that trade between Iran and the KRG amounts to $4 to $5 billion. The Turkish government has also made a number of sort of empty threats. They've threatened to cut access from KRG to the outside world, but they have yet to do so. Turkey has a lot more to lose from this. There are about 1,300 Turkish companies registered by the Kurdistan region, operating in the region. Kurdistan exports an estimated 650,000 barrels of oil per day through the Turkish Ceyhan pipeline, independent of Baghdad, and trade between Turkey and Kurdistan amounts to something like, I think, about $3 to $4 billion. The total trade between Turkey and Iraq is about $8 billion. All that comes through the Turkish border. And there's a lot of pressure on Turkey in general to not make the moves that is called for, because a lot of other powers in the world, specifically Russia, for example, also benefits from the trade that goes through the Turkish Kurdistan border. So although there's a lot of opposition to the Kurdistan referendum, it's yet to be seen whether a real blockade will happen against Kurdistan and whether this will force Kurdistan to go back on the referendum results.
And I've heard that there's so much trade between the central government and Turkey that goes through Kurdistan that would be something that hurts all of Iraq. It wouldn't just hurt Kurdistan. So the central government would not benefit from that.
Yeah, that's true. The central government, rather, has insisted on Baghdad taking control of oil revenue and other trade. They've actually done something quite strange, which is planning to set up border customs checkpoints between Turkey and Kurdistan, but they're doing this on the Turkish side. So it's not quite clear how they're planning to take control of the trade by setting up an additional border point on the Turkish side. But this is something obviously related to what you're mentioning with regards to the trade between Turkey and Iraq.
I'm talking with Goran Zaneti. He's an independent journalist on Middle East affairs, and we're talking about what's happening with Kurdistan and the vote for independence there that took place a week or so ago. Now, I noticed that Masoud Barzani, the leader of Iraqi Kurdistan, has had his term of office expire a couple of years ago, actually, and he's been governing without a mandate, and he is now scheduled parliamentary elections and presidential elections for November 1st. Can he run again and reestablish legitimacy, basically? Is this a factor in the whole drive for independence?
Well, the general consensus is that he cannot run again. His term was extended under special circumstances with agreements from some of the other political leaders from the other parties in Kurdistan. But the general consensus is that he cannot run again in November. He has scheduled elections in November. This was part of an agreement made prior to the referendum to get some of the other parties on board with the referendum, that they would schedule elections and that he would not run. He publicly stated that he wouldn't run. So I'd be really surprised if he fielded himself as a candidate. I expect that his political party, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, will field another candidate for the presidential election.
And how does that factor into the independence drive? What does that do for it?
Well, certainly Masoud Barzani is known to be the toughest negotiator. I mean, he has this reputation as being the toughest negotiator in the region. He has been the most outspoken in favor of Kurdish independence from Iraq. He was really the driving force behind holding the referendum and making sure it took place on time. So it will be interesting to see what happens if he's not specifically in power. But I do expect that, given the fact that he does have a lot of power in his own political party, that he will have quite a bit of influence over what happens in the coming months, regardless of who's president. So we'll just have to wait and see whether the KDP actually wins the presidency or one of the other political parties pull a surprising victory.
What about the United States in all this? The government came out and said the vote was not legitimate, and in spite of the way that the U.S. has worked with various Kurdish factions in the fight against ISIS, there's been no give on the independence issue. What should the U.S. do here?
Well, the United States, as you stated, has been against the referendum and against independence altogether from the beginning. They opposed the referendum prior to the vote, and they issued a statement. I believe Rex Tillerson issued a statement opposing the results of the referendum, saying that the results were illegitimate and the whole process was illegitimate. So the U.S. has taken a pretty surprising stance against the Kurdistan region. I say surprising because the Kurdistan region is America's top partner in the region in the fight against ISIS, and this relationship dates back to the Saddam days, specifically during the U.S.-Iraq War, 2003. So it is a bit surprising, but I think the United States at this point really needs to put pressure on the government in Baghdad to come to the negotiating table with the Kurds to work out an agreement, because obviously the tensions are really high. And the result could be an armed conflict between not necessarily Kurdish forces and Iraqi forces, but Kurdish forces and the PMF, which are illegitimate military militias that were created under then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki outside the foundation of the Iraqi armed forces. So this is violence that could erupt at any time. And I think that the United States is in the best position, obviously, as they have been in the past, to bring the two sides together and work out a deal that could satisfy both parties.
So your biggest fear would be some kind of conflict breaks out between these Shia militias and the Kurdish armed forces?
Yeah, I think so. I think in some parts along the southern border of the Kurdistan region, in the past there have been skirmishes between Kurdish forces and some of those militias, but I think tensions are very high, and those militias have been accused of oftentimes sort of reporting more to Maliki and to Iranian elements than to the Iraqi government. So it's a huge risk.
Goran Zaneti is a Kurdish American independent journalist, and he has produced a documentary on Kurdish refugees stuck on the Turkish-Syria border, and that documentary is called Resistance is Life. Thanks a lot for joining us and talking about what happens after the Kurdish vote for independence.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.